Welcome to the Hudson Area Library History Room Talk. We used to do these once a month, and then it seems like a lot of people want to give talks here, so the last couple of months it's been twice a month. This one is dear to my heart because I did grow up here, even though I did leave y'all for a little while, but I came back. And I remember driving as a kid, riding in the back and seeing this very interesting looking building by the Dutch trailer court and wondering about it. And I think a lot of us have that memory. So this talk by Ed Klinger is the history and work of preserving the Jan van Hoesen house. And before we get started, I'll tell you about a couple upcoming events. In May 10th, which is a Thursday at 6 p.m., the history of the Robert Jenkins House, a home in Hudson, a tour and a talk, and it will be by Jean Laporta, who is the Claverick historian, and she's a member of the DAR. This is in collaboration with them. We'll be going to the home at 113 Warren Street, and she will speak about the history, very interesting, and then we'll have a tour of the house. It is limited seating, so if you would like to sign up, please do soon, or you will be on the waiting list. And the next one is not really a history talk, it's a future talk. It's called Future Hudson, and Urban Designers' Imaginings, What Ifs, and Why Nots, by Matthew Frederick. And he has a book that's just come out this April called 101 Things I Learned in Urban Design School, published by Penguin Random House. That will be available for sale. And he'll be discussing Hudson from an urban design perspective, which should be really interesting after all the DRI work and the Raising Places work that's been going on in Hudson. People are thinking a lot about this. And then we have dancing coming back to the Armory with the City of Hudson Senior Center. We're hosting Spring Fling Swing Dance Party at the Hudson Armory with the Versatones. So that's Saturday, May 19 from 7 to 10. And I was like, the director of the Senior Center, Sheriff Stevens, said, it has to be 7 to 10. I'm like, I go to bed at 9, and I guess the seniors stay up more than me. So we'll have a time for questions and answers after the talk, and the refreshments are in the back. They're available courtesy of the Friends of the Hudson Area Library. And just to let you know, if you don't, the Van Hoesen House is listed on the National Register of Historic Places by the United States Department of the Interior. The Preservation League of New York State listed it as second in their 7 to Save list in 2009. And those of you who come to our history talks know I always stand up here and talk about how it'd be great if you gave a donation, which it would be. There's a lot that we want to do with our history room, including being able to archive the rest of our collection and put things digitally, especially our wonderful photographs and postcard collections and things that we have. But tonight, all the donations in the box in the hallway will go directly to the Van Hoesen House Historical Foundation. And they are fairly new, and they are very serious and very knowledgeable, and we're very hopeful that they will continue with this work, and it's important work. The foundation was founded in 2005 with its primary mission to find a long-term preservation solution for the deteriorating house. So I think you'll see how much knowledge and work is going into this. The speaker tonight, Ed Klinger, is a co-founder of the Van Hoesen Historical Foundation and has been a builder specializing in accurate historic restorations for over 40 years. An interest cultivated in him by the Van Hoesen House as a child growing up in Columbia County in the 60s. So, Ed?
Well, thank you very much, Brenda. You actually covered a lot of my first slide, but that's fine. You might as well start here. Yes, I am a member of a small not-for-profit, and we've been working with two of the park owners to find a preservation plan for the house that's going to work for them. Both us is a small not-for-profit and in agreement with the park and their goals. Yes?
Louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. We were supposed, is that better?
It has to be kind of close to your mouth, that's the only thing.
Well, let's see if, is that better? Okay. We'll see how we make out with this. All right. Well, actually, before getting into the architectural elements of the house and its significance, I think it's important to kind of relate a little of the social history of the house and the Van Hoesen family, since it's such an important element, not only to the town of Claverack, but the town of Greenport and the city of Hudson. Jan Van Hoesen, the builder of this house, it was his grandfather, Jan Franz, who came to America in the 1640s, first to New Amsterdam, later to Albany in the 1650s, and then ended up purchasing this tract of land at the city of Hudson, parts of Greenport, and the western part of, excuse me, Claverack now sit upon. He had numerous sons and daughters, and it was upon his death around 1700 that a portion of his lands along the Claverack Creek passed to his son Johannes, father of Jan. Jan was born in 1687 and married Taniki Whitbeck in 1711. And it was about that time that he then received a portion of his father's lands. And this house, as constructed now, is not that house. But there are elements in this house, salvage members that I will show you a little later on, which I believe probably date back to the time of his marriage, about 1711. There certainly have been any number of dates ascribed to this house, but realistically, as built, it really dates back no further than the 1730s, which, you know, that's not too bad, really. Anyhow, following their establishment on this part of his father's lands, it did remain in the Van Hoesen family up to the late 18th century, at which time the family, which had Tory ties, kind of fell out of disfavor. And it's known that his son ended up just living in Hudson. And we know by 1800, a Joseph Mosley, or excuse me, 1805, a Joseph Mosley from Connecticut had taken possession of the property and settled there, and actually then became Mosley Farm for several generations. Some of you may know in reading that Charles Marriott's name is associated with this house. He was a local citizen, instrumental in the Underground Railroad, and it's not yet proven that, although his name is associated with this house, that he was the actual owner. We're fortunate to have Ruth Polanka sitting on our board of directors, and many of you probably know her, very important local historian who's contributed so much to our area, and she's doing continuing research, and in the near future we'll be able to report back with a whole lot more certainty on this whole affair, but it certainly is not settled at this point in time. Well, the Mosley family owned the property up until about the 1870s, when it passed to the McGittrick family. And they then continued to live there really up until the 1960s. There's an article we have from the Chatham Courier from 1961, which references a brief comment by a Minnie McGittrick, who was 82 and a widow at the time, living there, and just making a few comments about the house. Following her death, I don't have an exact year, it was the early 1960s, the house did kind of fall into disrepair, although I don't think it was really much for upkeep before then. And it was then purchased by John Mulaski, a local developer, in the late 60s, and it was at that point in time that the farm was developed into a trailer park. John held it for a few years and sold it in the early 70s to the Zalis family, who we first started working with to come up with a plan for the house. But Peter Zalis, Ziggy Zalis' son, who inherited the park here a few years back, decided to pass it out of the family, and we're actually now working with a couple of very nice younger brothers who have a real estate investment firm from Western New York. They've owned the house and the park for a year and a half, and been nothing but very positive about giving us whatever impetus they can to continue with our preservation program. But coming back to, well, I guess that really does it for the house. It's up to us at this point, isn't it, to take it forward. This is just another shot. I'd just like to point out, this is the side of the house away from Route 66. It faces north, and it's the actual original facade. The road from Clavert to Clavert Landing, which is now Hudson, Clavert Landing in the time of the Van Hoesens in the 18th century, the road ran to the north of the house, and it wasn't until about 1806 when the Union Turnpike, Route 66, was put through that the whole orientation with the house, of course, was changed at that time, and there were some changes to the house that reflect that change in the roadbeds. This is a little aerial photo. The arrow indicates the location of the house. It's high on the first bank above the floodplain of Clavert Creek, but this is a very traditional location for a Dutch house. It was a favored location by the early farmers. Protected the house, of course, from spring floods, but also allowed them access to those very rich and fertile alluvial plains along whatever creek they happened to have settled along. We also get a sense of the distance to the Hudson River, and unfortunately this photo does crop the city of Hudson, which is, you just see a corner of it in the lower left corner. This is the earliest known photo we have of the house, dating to 1961, and that newspaper article in which Minnie McGettrick is quoted. We'd love to have an earlier photo of the house. None have been located yet, but I guess that's just an appeal to the general public out there that should one come across such a photo, we'd love to hear from you. This is sort of the condition I remember the house as a kid, as a child in the 60s, and well, I think we've all seen the deterioration since then. I think maybe before moving on to the next photo, I'd like to clear a few things up. There have been, like I said, a number of dates ascribed to this house. Architectural evidence indicates that it really, in this form, could not have been constructed before the 1730s. It's often given a date of 1729, but that has mistakenly been lifted from this very same article, and that date belonged to a stone house, which was further up the Clavert Creek on the opposite side, very close to where Route 23B crosses over the Clavert Creek. That was also a Van Hoesen house that basically fell into disrepair and collapsed in the early 20th century. This is a nice simple section drawn through the house, courtesy of John Stevens, a friend of mine, an architectural historian, which details the basic structure of one of these houses. You'll notice there's a basement fireplace. The original kitchen in this house was in the basement. And then you will notice the first floor with the heavy overhead joists, and you'll see these corbels or knee braces, which are part of the structural system to keep the wooden frame from swaying, which bears some mention. These brick houses are actually a brick veneer over a wood frame. They're not like an English style where you basically have wood joists just set in pockets in masonry walls. It's one of the problems with the house because of settlement and the ability for the veneer to separate from the frame. And I think you'll see this as we go through some of the other pictures. But continuing upwards, you have what was always originally an open garret. The second story wasn't really used for sleeping originally. And then you have an upper garret, which was even further storage. And a lot of activities were done on the second floor, and that upper garret was used primarily for storage. Certainly one of the characteristics of these houses are the steep roof. It's something that just catches your attention. This is a photo of the interior of one of the rooms from the Daniel Winnie house that was formerly located at Bethlehem, New York. It was disassembled about 15 years ago, and this room was reinstalled in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a substantial restoration. What is significant here, I would like to point out, is this very Dutch fireplace called a hood, or a jet, and it's a jamless fireplace. You really have just a hearth, a tile border in many cases, and then you have this construction which hangs down from the second story, and it was always trimmed off with this large molding, and then a cloth was hung around the bottom to increase the draft up the chimney. But the thing about these houses is this particular joist, if you will, was much heavier than the other ones in the room because it was carrying a lot of the weight of the chimney. And these chimneys looked like a huge inverted funnel. They would start out 7 or 8 feet wide and taper up inside the house to just the width of the flue that you see coming through the roof. Again, courtesy of John Stevens, this is a drawing of the first floor plan in the house. The dotted lines indicate the overhead beams for the second story. The wall at the top of this picture is the wall that faces Route 66, and at the bottom, of course, would then be the eave wall, the original facade of the house, which now faces away. What's very significant about this house is it does have a center hall. Those of you who have gone out around the county and looked at some of these houses, such as the Van Allen House in Kinderhook, much more typically, they're based on what they call a 2-room plan. Each room would have an outside door and a single window. Another example would be the Bronx House in Coxsackie in Greene County. But the Van Hoesen family, by the 3rd generation in this country, were fairly wealthy. I mean, they were merchants shipping on the Hudson River, and besides their agricultural concerns, and so Jan was in a place to build a significant house like this. An interesting thing I've discovered in working in the house, you will see that this drawing by John, which was an early interpretation, shows again a similar large central joist running front to back of the house, which you do see in the later 18th century when they're still building these style Dutch houses, but they've become almost a pattern. More investigation has shown that there's actually smaller joists in the ceiling that run between the 2 walls, which to me, and I've always looked at these houses, is significant. It allows for a much higher ceiling because you're not spanning that great a distance, and it emphasizes what actually is a room in a house. We look at it as a hall, but in contemporary times, this would have been a place to receive visitors. They may never have made it as far as one of the actual rooms. And so you would have had a much more elegant feeling stepping into this entry, if you will, and meeting members of the household. The other thing significant about the house is it is 24 feet deep by 48 feet long, which is a very large house for the area. I can only think of a couple other ones that are a bit larger and 2-story. One would be Craylow in Rensselaer, and the other would be the Queenan's house, located across the river in Queenan's. Again, is another interpretation, very accurate. It's been borne out by much of the research we have done on the house by John Stevens of the original facade. You have a central entry, a Dutch door with a transom over it, and it's flanked on either side by tall casement windows. There's you can see a gutter sitting on large iron brackets which drained the roof and prevented it from the water from falling down along the foundation, taking the water away from the house. The only thing in that picture that has since been proven to be not accurate, this was not a divided transom like that. It was a little bit later wood mud system like you have now with double hung sash. And this is the facade as it now exists. As you can see that the larger window openings have been closed up. You have two later doors here that used to open onto a Victorian period porch. I can still recall being there in the early 70s, and the original door been bricked up, bricked over with a small window inserted, but somehow the original door frame is all there buried in the wall. It's been a pretty interesting survival. I'll take a moment. Can everyone hear me clearly? That's okay. Well, if anyone has a problem, just stick up your hand here and we will try to adjust ourselves. This is a detail of the decorative brick lintels over the original casement windows in the front of the house. The one on the top, here's a photo of one of the ones at Van Hoesen. It's a high style of decoration. You're not going to see it in a more common house, even a brick one. Some elements are the burned headers in black, where you just see the end of the brick laid over the stretchers, which remain in the common red. And then there's a water course laid over the top of the whole soldier course. And the ends of these bricks here are actually chamfered at a little angle to match the angle of the soldier courses is laid into the wall of the house. The lower picture is one of a lintel at Craylow, which was restored by New York State in the early 1930s. Somewhat similar. Some of the work they did there has been proven to not be correct. You'll notice there are diamond-shaped leaded glass in the casement sash. If it had been a Dutch house, as far as I know, all evidence of leaded sash in the Hudson River Valley was always in a rectangular pattern. So a bit of an anachronism there. But the point being that this is just a decorative element used in a well-to-do person's brick house from the period. This is a photo of the west gable, and I think that the chimney on this end really catches everybody's eye when they're driving by. It's a prominent feature, and the reason for this, and there used to be far many more examples of this around, is when you had a kitchen fireplace in a house like this, you needed a way to get the smoke from the fire up and out of the house. Keeping in mind with a Dutch fireplace like we had looked at a few frames back, you had no jambs to hide a flue in, so the only way to really do it was to build a narrow flue up the outside of the house and tie it into the chimney at the roof. An interesting thing is, almost directly across the street is the Columbia County Cooperative Extension, which under all of it is a small frame Dutch house. I suspect at some point further research will show it to be one of Jan's sons, and that has one of these engaged or expressed, it could be stated either way, chimneys all wrapped in aluminum siding, but it's still there. I guess another apparent thing here is the deterioration of some of the brickwork. You can see fissures and openings that have occurred here. But another thing, because this is the walkout basement, there is some failure in the wall here. It is canting out, but it basically is a buttressed wall that gets wider the closer you get to the footing. doesn't show too well here, but they were aware that they needed to support this tall wall with a little more structural reinforcement. Here we just have another shot looking up that gable. Again, you can notice some of the deterioration. I'd like to point out, you can see a little more clearly here these beam anchors, and they tie the wall to the frame. It was a system they had to try to keep the two of them together. And what is interesting to me is this house only has these four. There's four in this gable, and it doesn't seem that there were ever any other ones. And so that certainly hasn't helped with the separation that we're now looking at and trying to find a good solution for. This is a detail of that anchor. It consists of two parts. You have the obvious dagger-shaped part. The other part, the eye that it drops down through, actually extends through the wall and has a huge nailing pad that's nailed into the wooden post in the corner of the building, and that's how it all locks together. Okay, I think this is the view most people have been familiar with for many years. This photo was actually taken several years ago. In subsequent time, the porch really deteriorated. It was something we were able, fortunately, to address working with the owners next year, because I'm afraid with all the snows of this past March, it and a good portion of this wall would have been on the ground. Excuse me, I've just advanced. What we have here, this is an original casement window for the basement kitchen. On this side, we have a smaller plank frame, original. They're gone now, but at one point in time, there were approximately 1.25 inch thick dowels that allowed air to flow into this space. And the kitchen was, or the basement was originally divided into two areas. You had a kitchen on the left and basically a root cellar to the right-hand side. And there was a second basement entrance to the root cellar directly. That wooden lintel there covers what was a former door opening to that portion of the basement. The door and window frames in the back wall are either original or close to original. This door frame is original to the construction of the house. We'll look at that a little bit more in detail later. These tall, narrow frames are interesting, whereas the front of the house has casement sash. These tall, narrow frames are slightly later in construction and held a 9/9 double hung sash. I've been trying to look behind this more recent stucco to see if there's evidence for earlier window frames, casements that might agree with the front, but I can't say anything truly definite has been determined yet. The other thing, in looking at the roof, you will see how the metal roof has been kind of formed up over the parapets. Originally, these houses, the brick walls extended beyond the plane of the roof in a parapet. And you would just see the edge of the brick. And this was a holdover from a building practice in the Netherlands where they were using pan tiles, clay tiles, and they needed a way to protect those tiles which were just hung over lug poles from being blown off from the strong winds. Some people have asked, well, were there clay tiles on this or other Dutch houses in the New World? There's some evidence in some very early 17th century structures, yes, but by and large these houses all had wood shingle roofs originally. Now, this is a detail of the molding over that back door we were just looking at. Just a really handsome piece of surviving piece of, architectural history. Most of this stuff is usually lost to time through rot and remodeling. So that's one of the things about this house, is just so much that survives. More importantly, there are some changes in the house, none of which have really eliminated anything of the feel of the original structure, but just overall, everything complements itself. And we'll get to that in a little bit. This is the east gable. I think I won't dwell on this picture. We have a couple here. This is a detail of the east gable. And the important thing here, of course, is the monogramming in the burned brick. You have excuse me, I keep hitting the wrong button here. So you have a T. Interestingly enough, that is Britannically Whitbeck, Jan's wife. So I've always been amused that the wife took precedence over the husband. That was very nice. A thoughtful gentleman. And then, of course, we have an I, which is the Dutch J for Jan, or John. And, of course, Van Hoesen. You can also really get a sense here of these triangular patterns of brick that were laid to form the parapets. The term is vlekstenen in the Dutch. And it's a nice survival. Of course, the top of this house has been rebuilt. That's all a hard modern brick, probably dating back to the early 20th century. As far as the window arrangement, these two frames in the upper garret are original. They never contained window sash. All they would have had would have been a solid panel wood shutter that would have been closed up in winter and other harsh times of weather. The two lower windows that exist were installed around 1800. They're a Federal style window. They have Federal moldings on the inside, quite delicate and nice, indicating an early Federal period installation. And despite it being over 200 years, you can still see a slightly lighter mortar here where they did that work to change out those windows. So again, we're coming back to the full gable. This window was installed very late in the 19th century, and I'll show its relationship to the inside of the building in a minute. And we'll take you in through this door to the interior of the house. This originally was added during Victorian times. There is evidence in the brickwork above this door that there was a fifth window that matched the floor and the back wall under the porch. Okay. This is the first room you step into, the east room on the first floor of the Ed Klinger house. Really here, as far as the Dutch house, the most apparent thing are these very heavy ceiling joists. This one, which carries the chimney for the freehung fireplace, is 18 inches high and 9 inches wide. These are massive, massive timbers, easily weighing 600 to 800 pounds apiece. What is interesting in the house is you will notice there were never any knee braces installed here, which is indicative of a slightly later date. Usually you see knee braces in houses right up to the middle of the 18th century. But also in this room you see some of the changes that have been incorporated into the house. In this bay between these two beams, originally there had been a large casement window, but this of course is a very Victorian period window, reduced in size, wainscot. This small sink in the corner is the only plumbing that was ever in the house. This one basin sink. And there are just some remains of oilcloths and other floor coverings on the floor here. Pulling back a little bit, this whole chimney breast with cupboard and mantel dates to the early Federal period. It was built right upon the hearth for the freehung fireplace. And unfortunately, some of the detail doesn't show here, but it's done in kind of a naive but high Federal style. There's a collection molding, and that same collection is repeated here across the face of the mantel. And then it was flanked by this cupboard, which originally had raised panels top and bottom. And then at the time of the installation of this little kitchen, they knocked out the wood panels and put in glass and shelf paper, which dates back to the 1920s, which is all kind of fun. This particular ghost mark you see in the paint relates to a board wall that was installed during Victorian times. This room was actually divided up at a peculiar angle. It wasn't straight down the middle of the house. I was in the house in the late 60s a couple times and didn't make it back till about 13 years ago, at which time someone had nicked that wall, but not, I guess it's not the worst loss. Some of that sheathing still remains in the house, stacked up in a pile, but I guess obviously someone thought they needed it for their living room or something similar. Okay, turning around now, we're looking towards the center hall. The original door to the hall is this one, hanging on original strap hinges, although originally it was hinged on this side. It was changed at some point in time. This door was added later on when that board wall, which you see here indicated by these ghost marks in the paint, was added. And in that way, they converted one very large, nice room into two smaller, sort of cramped feeling ones. But I guess it served a purpose. And this is the center hall, looking towards the original back of the house. Prominent thing here is the stair, which is, again, a very elegant design for one of these houses. Closed stringer, but with balusters and a handrail rising up from one corner of the hall. Very typical of a center hall Dutch house. They were building them until the Dutch style fell out of favor around 1800, where you would have this stair, which would go up to a landing, and then it would always turn right against the back wall and land you on the second floor. This is a detail of that back door I had mentioned that we would be getting to. This is the original frame that was installed when the house was constructed. There are still plugs in this jamb here for the original Dutch door, which is not there. There was originally a single row of glass here, but at some point in time the wood muttons that held the glass were knocked out and a single piece was installed before kids knocked that out. Fortunately, there's never been a lot of vandalism at the house, but I did have one, I guess, conscientious gentleman now in his 30s or 40s stopped by a while back when I was working on the house to admit they'd gotten into the house and broken a couple windows back in the 60s. But I assured him that he was forgiven and thanked him for his interest. The door itself is a Federal period door, which was itself modified in Victorian times. I've recovered pieces of glass. The upper panels, which were wood, were removed, and it was an embossed milk glass, very Victorian style, that they then installed into the door to change that. And again, I'd just like to mention what impresses me most about the house, having worked with historic structures my whole life, is, as I said, there are all these little changes made to the house, but really, the original house is still there. It just continues to fascinate me, and I've been working on the building for 10 years now, and still making little discoveries about changes. This is a view looking down that hall to the front of the building. Sorry I didn't get a closer picture of the whole unit, but this is the front door frame. Again, a division between what was the door underneath, the space now filled by a window, and above it there was a double row of glass. And I think this is the right time to mention that these smaller transverse joists in the ceiling behind the plaster, traveling this way across the hall. But not needing such a tall joist and section, they were able to achieve this double layer of glass without blocking the upper layer and giving that height to the hall. Hopefully at some point we're going to be able to slide a camera in from the outside and actually see what's going on there, get some ceiling colors, that sort of thing. It's just a lot more work to do, besides basic maintenance. Okay, again, this is just a detail of this transom area, which is pulled down here, and one of the conjectural things that was settled about the house a few years back was, did it have leaded glass, which was something that really went out of favor by about 1730. And here you have a very clear indication that it was a wood mutton that was let into the frame here to contain a 7x9 pane of glass. But when you see over the transom, this ribbon lath is a very early form of lath, used only into the very early 19th century. So you start to see these changes to the house started happening very soon. Quite possibly, now this happened around the time that the road was moved to the back of the house and the Union Turnpike was established. And that would make some sense. There's ample evidence on the original front wall of the house that at one point in time in the 19th century there was a full-length lean-to addition across the entire back. So of course you'd be closing up windows that really opened into nothing except the space under a roof. Go back to the hall. Just point out this red wash, probably no later than early 19th century. But I'd like to take you into the west room. Originally the same in size as the east room that we were first looking at, but at an early point in time it was divided into like a 1/3, 2/3 arrangement. You're now standing in the larger of the two rooms, which is located towards Route 66, towards the back of the house. This was a board wall originally, installed around 1800, I would say, plus or minus a few years. And it separated this little back room, which may have served as a bedroom at that point in time, from this main room, which also at that time, this whole entire freehung mass on the inside of the house was taken down in a federal period chimney, conventional jam chimney built. This is actually a Rumford-style fireplace that came into favor in the 1790s. There is also the eyes, but not the crane, for a crane. So it also might have been at this time that the kitchen was moved upstairs because there was obviously been ongoing water problems in the basement since about day one. We like to refer to it as the swamp. But alongside this chimney, you have some very fun, simple cupboards with doors still there. And I'm here to tell you that that horse tack has been hanging there since 1969 at least. Originally in this room, those large joists I pointed out in the first room passed through the wall, and at some point, very late in Victorian times, unfortunately, it changed, I accept it, but they did cut back the beams in this room and remove some other elements to get this nice ceiling in a Victorian parlor. And what I think is interesting, you're looking at a time when people had a certain amount of money in their budget to remodel things. So you have someone, let's say in 1890, they had the wherewithal to, and ambition really, to chop 4 or 5 inches off the bottoms of these beams so they could plaster the ceiling. They then papered the walls. This is a grass paper, an arts and crafts grass paper, which originally ran all the way around the room. And then there is a carpet sewn in signatures, which is basically a 30-inch wide strip of carpet that was rolled out one next to the other, and then they were sewn together in signatures. I have a little better picture to show you that. So while they did that to get this more modern sense of style in this room, they never touched the Federal period mantel. They did add a little shelf over it, but as it turns out, the reason for that, the original mantel was out of level by about 4 inches from end to end. If you reach under there, on this side, I believe it is, you touch the bottom of the original mantel, and on this side, the bottom of the original mantel shelf is like 3 inches up under that molding. Again, substantial settlement in the house. They also didn't bother to mess with any of the baseboard in the room. The 18th century baseboard is still all there. And then on, and this is the other wall, the wall facing 66. You can see you'll have to excuse me, I like that button for some reason or another, and I shouldn't. You still have the 18th century baseboard, which they've just run this Victorian carpet to. These are those 9/9 later plank frame windows dating probably the 18th century. Still in place. They actually have a little bevel into the ceiling when they plastered to keep them. But I want to specifically point out this very nice rosy pattern in the roof. So it's kind of impressive just to see something from that time that survived for 120 years or so. I was actually a little negligent. There's an oilcloth and another remnant of carpet in the center hall that date back even further into the 19th century. Okay, this is the smaller room that resulted after the division of the West Room. And in this room, you really see the survival of a very early Dutch frame. And this frame are just a series of vents where this is the common wall to the hall. And then you have this series where you have these very heavy knee braces. They're very early in design. If you remember the Winnie House photo, by that point in time, the mid-18th century, those knee braces are really getting kind of small, almost vestigial. But these are huge. They're in an early style. You'll see where they haven't been plastered in, that there's actually a small gap in the corner where they join the post in the wall. It's my theory that this was probably part of the frame for the original house that Jan lived in with his wife when he married her in 1711. It stands to reason he would have had the means at that time to have gotten something up for them. And so even though a one-room house, substantial in size and construction. So this is looking the other way towards the gable end. And some of the things which I wish would come out a little bit clearer here, but I will point out, are this is still a remaining part of the frame for one of the casement windows. It ran that close to the ceiling, which is typical. They're right up against the ceiling. Down here, there's also more of a frame. Well, how about that? Gotta love it. Anyhow, getting back to the matter at hand, and no, I won't be renewing my Malwarebytes. This section of plaster here between these two vents is all original. And the way it was constructed is, as I said, you have this wood frame house the frame is put up first, and then it's veneered. But on the outside, they're passing by the outside face of these posts with just one layer, one thickness of brick. But then they're laying the brick back into the cavities, which is why you see those shorter brick, the header brick. And then they're laying another course inside and just plastering over it. There's no plaster and lath in this house other than what's been added at a later time. We're back out to the hall. We'll get you upstairs. And I took this shot just to illustrate a little bit better looking up one of these stairs and that landing at the back wall. And there's a couple more steps that just head off to the left. Again, looking at the top of the landing, some more of this red wash under a Victorian period wallpaper. Even this wall in the house is brick and plastered. It's not lath. Interestingly, it has subsided a little bit from this joist at the top, and when you look in there, you can still see the stud pockets from the end wall of Jan's original house. And again, I'll be bold enough to make the claim that that was his original house. I think time will bear me out. Okay, we're now upstairs on the second floor. Originally, this would have been most probably entirely open, a workspace. Any of you who've been up to the Manal house have seen how it's been set up for a workspace and where winter activities would be conducted. This house, again at the end of the 19th century, was improved substantially, nicely, with 4 bedrooms. There is a center hall upstairs with 2 bedrooms at either end, but all the bedrooms have a Victorian wainscot around, chair rail. What you see here that's earlier, the plastering is all much later. There's evidence on the opposite end of the house that all they had, they basically whitewashed the rafters and the roof boards originally. Very primitive. But here what you see, you still have the collar ties, which are part of the rafter framing system, evident. And all of these windows are the Federal period 9/6 windows with later sash. But all of them are trimmed out in very nice, delicate band molding. This is another one of the upstairs bedrooms. Again, you have that same treatment done during Victorian times. Plasterwork all dates to that time as well. But in this particular room, you have this massive corner, and the reason for that is the one end of the house still contains the flue for the free-hung chimney. So at that point, it's 8-10 feet wide at the base. So all they could do was box it in. But around the corner here, someone conveniently knocked a hole in the side of this enclosure, and you can still look in and see the whole inverted flue just sitting in there. Now, this is the upper garret. Fortunately, it's become a rookery for pigeons. It's high on my list this year for dealing with. They really are not the most hygienic of folks, I will say that, but we will just stick with pointing out some of the architectural details and not curse the wildlife. I have it on good authority, though, that the hawks that live across the street have been picking the pigeons off, so it's just the way of nature.
Nature for them.
Yes. Anyhow, you really get a sense of the pitch of the roof. And when you have a house with such a steep roof, you have a second set of these collar ties. This floor here is actually resting on the first set, which later in the 18th century, when you have a flatter roof pitch, you just do not get this second. There was no need for this second set of ties. Beyond that, this is it. Like I said, this is that Federal period chimney, which ties into that later fireplace below. But when they remodeled, they left whatever brick was engaged with the gable wall from the original freehung there. You still see all the black from the soot on either side. And you're also looking at the original plank frames that just contained those shutters either side of the chimney. Something that doesn't show here too well, but you'll notice a slight arc here against that rafter. And that's because on the inside of this rafter, towards the center of the building, they actually hollowed it out so that they could run their brick kind of behind the rafter, which would tie that gable wall to the frame. Now, sometimes you see that done with some of those iron beam anchors, but I don't know what happened in this house. maybe the budget suddenly ran out, but it seems to be a shortage of those things. Interestingly, at each corner of the upper garret is one of these saplings. It's nailed to the bottom of the rafters with a wrought nail at each rafter. And speaking from contemporary construction practices, this was a way to stabilize the rafter pairs as you were putting them up and before you had all of the sheathing on the roof. So that's just an amusing thing to see that survive. No one bothered to take it down after they were done. I'd also like to point out something about the roof boards here. They actually have a bevel, so one lays over the other as you go up. So it's not watertight, but it makes for at least a wood surface that's going to shed a lot of the rain. And again, this is conjecture, but I believe that trying to get a house up and trying to protect it at the time, the best way to do that was to come up with this very primitive system where if you're only getting 5 or 10% of any rain shower in the house until you can finish making all your shingles and getting them on the roof. So there's one of several types of roof sheathing systems you see here. I've seen other types, but this seems to be one, as I said, I speculate was utilized when they needed to protect the structure because they knew they weren't going to get it all shingled off for the next week. And here's a better shot looking down that upper garret. This brings us back out to the corner, and I want to take a look at detail some of the problems we've been dealing with and are working through. Oh, I just love that button. You will see here, no, this isn't a fisheye lens. There's a huge bubble, if you will, in the masonry. It's one of the worst places in the house where the masonry has just pulled away. And it's one of the things we're now focused on. Obviously, the exterior walls is something we're more focused on, and I will explain a little more about that later in my closing comments. We also have this porch. Again, this is an earlier picture I had in the archives, but this diagonal bracing is all gone now. If you've been past the house, I've just added posts. And I mean, who knows what's going to become of this porch in the long run, but it's part of the house. Seems to only date, I say only date, to the mid-20th century, but to us it's important to save all of the history of this house because we're not looking for a 1735 restoration or whatever. So in working with this, I was very careful to document what I just tore out that was rotted. I ensured that there were similar repetitive elements left in the part of the porch I could save for future documentation. But like I said, at this point, I'm just glad I was able to do that last year. And because with the snows of this past winter, it just would not have ended well. I'll come back to this corner again with a focus on both certain areas where the mortar is completely gone out of the wall. This little triangle here sits on top of the window frame. It's completely free. And you can see a little wave in the wall looking down the original facade of the house. But principally, there's all these little areas and issues with the brickwork. Again, some more of that deterioration in a different light. And there are going to be parts of the building we're going to have to figure out how we can try and at least stabilize the walls so they don't move further from the frame. We're really loath to try and take any more of the building apart than we have to do that, but I think somewhere in here we're going to have to work in some fasteners. But those decisions are being reserved until the end of our study. And again, here are a few of us, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner, the bricks have completely fallen away from these two end posts, and the bottoms of them are just completely rotting off. So there is, repairs to the frame to consider as well. You can see, I guess, a general undulating movement in the headers. So these are all things we're dealing with. Something I neglected earlier, I can point out here. You will see here, here. Those are iron gutter brackets, which have survived. 4 of the 5 on that side of the house have survived, and that would have carried the gutter that collected the water from the roof. We have been working with the State Education Department, the State Museum, several archaeological digs. This was the first one we conducted, I think, in 2011 with the State Museum. We got them in there because we began the construction of a drain line to the basement of the house. And again, we'll get back to that swamp issue in a minute here. But we are trying to do all work here by the book, document everything thoroughly, and just a beautiful week to come out and dig a trench for us so we could lay the drain line up to the door to the basement. This is just a pullback shot, and we have Chuck Orser here in the foreground, who was the director at the time and managing the dig, working at a few of the screening boxes. All the soil is taken out and just run through these screens to collect any artifacts. And here are several. This piece on the left is a piece of Delftware, a little bit left of the blue and white. And this piece is what I call pearlware. One of the things I don't have a photo of, Chuck had mentioned that in their day they came up with part of a potter's wheel out of this trench. He said it's the only recorded instance of an 18th century potter's wheel being found north of Manhattan. So that was gratifying. I'm sure some of you know what this is. Well, it's part of a clay pipe stem. And any Dutch house you happen to be digging around one of the doors, or probably anywhere close to the building, you're going to come up with a few of these. Since typically they were started long stemmed and then they would kind of break them off as they collected resin from the tobacco. Something I didn't have time to photograph and include was, while working on the house last summer, next to the rear door to the house in one of the masonry joints, I found an entire clay bowl. There just was a lot of, glass and debris, and I said, well, I'll clean that out, or it's just going to be on the ground. And as I was carefully removing it, this thing came to light. It must have fallen down on the stoop and rolled into this little cavity. So we have that now. Okay, here is the swamp. That's just plain old water. The basement of this house has been seeing water for a long time. Despite that, the joists for the first floor are in amazingly good shape. Yes, the powder post beetles have found a few residences, but they can enjoy their time for a little while longer. In the meantime, this, I think, is one of our priorities. There is approximately 12 to 18 inches of just fill, and we're not talking most probably interesting fill. We're talking coal ash, coal, cobble rock. There was a very obvious attempt to try and raise the basement floor above some level where the water would not be collecting in it. One of the last efforts was this iron pipe system. They just gave up and laid it right on top of the floor to try to get it out to the door. But it remains a major issue. There are heavy clay soils around the house. Water does tend to collect. It's something Another theory put forward, we're not sure of yet, we've made some efforts with the Greenport Water Department, is there may be an original line to the house from the 1930s that enters in this area, which may not have been, or the capping on that line has failed. But again, coming back to a priority and need to really get this basement sorted out is high on our list, and I'll speak a little more to that in a minute. This was the finished dig, and just me out there laying pipe up to the basement door in anticipation of getting the rest. I think you can see here where we're coming in. That's how much fill is in this basement. We're approximately at the original grade of the basement floor. Now that concludes most of the slideshow. I'd like to point out we've had a little modification in our website. You need to stick JAN, Jan, in front of that if you want to find us. We had a little snafu between changing webmasters here back in the fall, and I myself never received a notification. The domain was up for renewal, and I guess someone in Germany thought it'd be a good idea to purchase the site. So I wish them good luck with it, and we've just personalized it a little bit more. So we are back up and going, and I'm happy to say that a good friend of mine has taken over some of the web responsibilities as we look to consolidate some of the things we have achieved. But if you do want to note that, please remember that you do have to stick Jan, J-A-N, in front of that to get to our website. Our original webmaster, terrific guy, he did a great job with the site. We are looking to improve the site here over the coming year. It's one of our pressing goals. It tends to remain static, but fairly informational. If you've been out there, I think we've done a good job. But as we hopefully have more events unfolding more quickly, I'd just like to be able to keep the general public updated with it. I think in closing, I really haven't maybe explained as thoroughly as I would like our goals for the house. Often you see these buildings bought and then immediately there's a problem because there aren't the people to handle the technical end of it. I think we've been very fortunate, besides myself, and maybe it's because it's such an iconic house, people seem to drift in, and the right people, and always in the nick of time, to offer their services to deal with the issues we face. Besides myself on the technical end of things, an old good friend, Steve Anderson, who's with us tonight in the back, he also sits on our board of directors and working with me for all of those issues. We're fortunate to have Ruth Pawanka, a noted Kinderhook historian, sitting on our board, whose assistance and knowledge absolutely invaluable. Susan Winchell-Sweeney, our latest member, an archaeologist for State Museum, who is helping to coordinate this dig as well as some of the issues we had last year. We discovered late last spring that the county was intending to run a sewer line past the house, and they thought the best place to put pump station number 7 was between that tree and the gable. So that's when we played the National Register trump card. I have to say Susan in her position was really instrumental in coordinating between SHPO and the engineering firm for the county, and it really, I'm being a little dramatic, wasn't that much of a face-off. We were able to settle on a far better site for their pump station and protect the integrity of the remaining open land around the house. And our last board member is another friend, Gage Rommel, with a deep background in web development and IT. So We always are looking for new blood in other areas where we may not have expertise, so anyone that appears to contribute. One of the things I felt strongly about is coming back to this problem when a small group gets a historic structure. There's a number of problems, but one of them is, we don't have the technical people. We do. We don't have to necessarily go to an architectural firm for consultation, who often don't have the background we have. And I don't say that out of arrogance. There are a number of organizations here in the Hudson Valley who we have complete access to. The study of Dutch houses is something that's really was initiated in the 1960s, and I'm pleased to say I personally know just about every serious academic. And it's our hope as a board to engage as many as possible. Many of them are engaged in consultation as we formulate a plan for preservation, as well as just identifying all the elements in this very complicated structure. But to the house itself, as I said earlier, we're not looking to make this a pristine 1740 restoration. It's more our interest to preserve as is, as long as it's stabilized and doesn't deteriorate further. There may be decisions that are coming down the road where we're going to have some tough choices, but at this point I would also say last year, noted Dutch preservation architect Andre Hoop from the Netherlands, who was relocated here, found us and has offered his services. He has an extensive background, and there's actually more than 7 surviving examples of this type of house in the Netherlands. So we're working with him, and that brings me to the next thing. We are trying to organize better for our fundraising. Hopefully by this summer we can maybe have a volunteer day or two. It may take longer to, in a scientific way, get all the mud out of the basement. Working on setting that up with Susan. But our main focus is the problem with the walls. And at this point, we're trying to study, evaluate, before some big piece of the house ends up on the ground. And the best news, which we just received a month or so back from Andre, who is back in the Netherlands at this point, is a firm in the Netherlands, a laser mapping firm, has agreed to come across the pond here to basically, with computers and lasers, map the whole exterior of the house for detailing changes in brickwork, to mortar patterns, the various movements in the wall, a thorough analysis to help us really understand both what's going on with the house historically and structurally. But the catch there would be we need to cover their flight and their own board. So currently working on getting a kind of list of expenses up for that. A house like this really is kind of a study house. I'd like to give Bill McMillan, the former director of Historic Richmond Town and Staten Island, credit for mentioning that to me first, and he's right. Some buildings can be repurposed. There's nothing left but an exterior, so it doesn't matter what the interior is like. But I think, as I've tried to show you, this house has such an intricate and complicated architectural history, which also ties into the highs and lows of the economic history of Columbia County. A prosperous Dutch period. You have that time when the proprietors are here in Hudson, and you see those federal changes in the house. And then it seems to be a little bit of a lull in the early 19th century, but again, late 19th century, a time when Columbia County was a fairly booming mill county. You see these changes in the bedrooms and a better time, and it follows it right into the 20th century, and especially after the Second World War, when everyone was deserting the rural hinterlands for the city, is really when the house met its fate. So ultimately, at this point, working as we have, the idea is to get this thing stabilized. With that, of course, people are going to ask grants. We have not done a lot of that. We worked with the Zalis family for many years. We could never really find suitable terms for everyone. But the Zalis family did recognize the importance of the building and always allowed us to conduct whatever work we needed to do, from educational tours to emergency stabilization things. The best thing that's actually happened to this house is that a year ago this past winter, as I mentioned, it was acquired by the Cook brothers from Western New York, who have a very keen interest in history. He actually, the one brother, Jeff, was quite excited. Even before he closed, he contacted me about the house and getting work done. And then we just had to hold off at the request of the Zalis family until the deal was done. They were a little nervous by him jumping the gun, but since then they've been very supportive of our efforts. And I think the kicker there was the Zalis family did want a substantial amount of money for the house on an acre, and Jeff and his brother will be happy to just assign stewardship to us. We're just trying to work out whether that's going to be through a long-term lease or purchase. You know, the problem facing a small organization is coming up with excuse me, purchase price. So, hey, long-term lease is fine by us. But coming back to the house and its purpose as a study house, one thing we've learned as a small group is museum houses don't really sell very well over the long term. People come once, they look, maybe come back twice. Unless you're a real maniac, you're not going to really be visiting it a lot. Let's face it, the site is not really secluded enough for a monastery or anything of that nature. So, but of course, it's very important to the history of the county and architectural history. So, again, looking far down the road, an idea we kick around, again, theoretical, knowing our limitations, is an auxiliary building on site to both house our activities, which at that point in time could include seminars of any sort dealing with architecture, history, preservation, anything appropriate. No late night bar stuff, but also within this structure, which I think could be reasonably big. Maybe we can find a Dutch bar in the room, I thought, something that resembles it. But we also have been working a little bit with the Collaborative Historical Society, who's looking for a home. It would be a perfect place to site them. And I certainly have been in contact with many members of the Van Hoesen family over the years. And within this building, I think it would be a perfect place to house a genealogical library for them. And there have also been a few other groups with a focus on history and/or historic preservation I've talked to who have expressed an interest in partnering. Again, that is, I think, a long ways off unless suddenly a substantial amount of money drops in our lap, but it's a goal because, like anything, as soon as you spend the money, that structure, whatever's got to start paying for itself. And right now, progress has been slow, but it's going in the right direction. The current owners of the building and the people we have working on it. Well, I hope I've covered it all, or at least some of it. I'll be happy to talk to anyone after the talk, but I would take any general questions you may have now.
And I'm going to turn on the light, just to...
Certainly, certainly. Well, why don't we just start right up front with this gentleman right here.
Van Hoesen built the house.
Jan Van Hoesen, the grandson of the original patentee, built the house, yes.
Was he out there to work some more, or?
Oh, no, figure of speech, I see what you're saying. No, he would have, I assume he would have been tending to his agricultural holdings. He may have been part of the merchant side of the family, but he himself would not. There would have been local carpenters and masons who actually.
That is the porch. That's the back. Where the porch is.
Where the porch is now, what you see from Route 66 is the original back of the house.
Okay. And that's the front of the house.
The front of the house faces the trailer park. It's unusual, it faces north. The only explanation is the original road from Claverick to Hoesen, which was Claverick Landing, then the Van Hoesen wharf on the river, ran to the front of the house. So far, have found no evidence where that road might have been. It's known from some early
Isn't
maps.
that where there's a stream or something, the Claverick Creek, where is that?
If you were to walk directly from that gable to the west, this way, to the right of the screen, you are headed towards Claverick Creek.
Okay.
That's a shot actually looking up that bank from the floodplain of the creek. I've actually seen that creek up to the base of that tree there. I think some of you probably have seen times at the Bunker Bridge where the stream has come up across the road behind the bridge on the Claverick side. I'll work my way back.
Sure. Me?
Yes, you.
When is the last time there have been outbuildings, any standing barns, or do you have any memory of those?
I have a slight memory. My memory of the house goes back to the early 60s. When I was, 7, 8, so that's a pretty sick preoccupation. But
Yeah.
off of the back corner you see there, because it was the back of the house, I remember there being an outhouse.
Okay, because the only plumbing was in the kitchen there, right?
No, there never was, a bathroom in the house.
Uh-huh.
That little sink in the corner was the only plumbing that was ever there.
Did they fill that sink with water from the creek, or did it have a pump?
There was a line that runs down into the basement. And that all ties into this concern we have about water in the basement, and maybe that sink may have only been installed in the 1930s, and there's still that line somewhere and all that muck that is leaking. And so that's why we have that priority with the basement, to get back to that. I mean, the actual trees around the house have changed substantially. There were 3 or 4 maples in the front yard until 6 or 7 years ago. One of them, directly in front of the house, went over during a big storm, and if it had gone the other way, there would have been no need for me to be standing here talking. But it did go the other way. Again, coming back to the 60s, when that house just sat out in this tall sea of grass, grown-up fields, there was just a straight lane that went right back to the far side of the house, straight back from 66, and it was lined with locust trees.
Wow.
I remember that. This gentleman back.
Were those bricks, they've been made on site, or was there a commercial brick?
They would have been made locally. There's a lot of stories about Dutch brick being brought over, and I think, for probably some of the earliest residences, we're talking 1630s or 40s, either at New Amsterdam or Beverwyck, Albany. They would not have had that established, but Columbia County for many years, especially through the 19th century, was a major brick making. So the clays have always been here to make those brick. Years ago, I can remember attending a very interesting talk by Shirley Dunn, another local historian who has done a lot of work documenting activities in the Van Rensselaer Manor, slightly north of here, Albany and Rensselaer County. And I'm a little fuzzy on the number, but by the 1630s, so we're talking basically 15 years after Dutch settlement begins, they have like 15 operating sawmills. They're already cutting and sawing a lot of timber for boards for various things. Well, I saw the man behind you, then I'll get you.
Okay. So are the chestnut beams in the house? Do you know what the large beams are made? Kind of
They
what?
are actually a hard pine, a yellow pine, which is pretty much extinct in the area. Chestnut is something, from what I've seen in this area, it doesn't really come into use till a little later. There is evidence, and another buddy of mine, an architectural historian who documents a lot of these houses, maintains that the earliest of these houses had oak beams, at least on the first floor. I know you can get down into Dutchess County, the Dutch houses there, all of those very handsomely planed beams in the first floor for the second story, or a lot of them are in a poplar or tulip wood. But here in Columbia County, and you don't ever want to be dogmatic, but primarily the posts and the flooring is all in this hard pine, and it's hard, it's sappy. I've worked repairing plank floors in these houses. You can cut through a board to length, and there'll be a pitch pocket there that's, over 200 years old, and the sap will still run out. And then you're kind of stuck till you can pry your hand off the sawhorse.
So, where in that corner there where the bricks are missing, where you showed where they had fallen out, to repair that, would you find period brick, or would you just repair it with?
We are looking, actually, Steve, one of our board members, has come up with quite a few. We have a few other sources. And we'll look to match for color and size, all of those things. That's an area we're probably going to have to get into, where those posts are rotted, to really add some support. But at this point, my conjecture is, rather than tearing out any more of the wall than we have to, we're just going to find some good wood and maybe work some steel in there to keep the frame from settling. Like I said, this is more a catch and hold project rather than something to be made pristine. Okay. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Are there any plans to do more digs and specifically look for Mohican artifacts that maybe would be near the creek?
That could come up in the future. Somewhere kicking around in the files, I know the Zalis family, when they upgraded the sewage system for the park, were required to conduct archaeological digs. And they didn't have any substantial finds, but I think they did locate a few stone tools, arrowheads, in the process of that investigation. We're not, besides the basement, which is our, that all just can't be shoveled out. Somewhere down there, we need to determine what was the floor in the original kitchen, things like that. The other thing that may become more pressing is this new sewer line for the county. We've got the pump station moved, but the line is going to be passing past the house close to the tree. They're going to be using a lot of horizontal coring, which is fine. We're not trying to stand in the way of progress, but coming back to why that one room incorporates the earlier frame, and I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Typically, you would see a family establish themselves with a one-room house, and then they would just add to it. That one-room house has been taken apart and moved there. There's no evidence, there's no seam in the basement walls that it was just a one-room foundation. There just is nothing there to indicate that, which means, where did that frame come from? You're probably not going to have moved it too far. I mean, it's a lot of work. But what does happen, of course, you get to the 17th century, you see more and more accounts of people making a mistake building their house in the floodplain of the creek and the house getting washed off the foundation. So quite possibly down near that tree or somewhere in that area where they're coring, there may be an earlier foundation that house was taken from. Again, speculative, but reasonable. Also, typically, any dumping site for a house was downhill. The site's been complicated because also on the far side of the trees, there was a roadbed put in the 60s for the park. So there's been a lot of excavation and moving the soils around the house. Okay, gentlemen.
Talk to me. Sure. In Rome, you can't really fix anything or build anything because every time you dig, you find Roman ruins that are fairly important. And so if they were trying to put the sewer line through and you found something pretty important, then is there a way to stop that from happening?
Well, I guess there's always legal recourse. We would, at this point, like I said, in the spirit of community and not trying to get any conflicts, because we obviously have our hands full with what's in front of us, plan to do a little more investigation in that area with some pits and all to see if any of the conjecture might be true. I thought there was a hand more towards the back at one point that I had neglected. Oh,
Yeah, so I know the Van Allen house, they had slave quarters in the basement, and when slavery was stopped in New York State, they took out the chimney that led down because they didn't want any evidence that they had slaves. Something seemed to change very quickly. But I just wondered, is there evidence that there were slave quarters or servant quarters down in the
the
basement?
Van Hoesen family were very definitely slaveholders.
Uh-huh.
And there's records of that. And they would have had slaves who probably would have slept in the basement.
So would the chimney have heated the basement? Because that's what I had in the Van Allen house.
Well, it would have been used for cooking.
Uh-huh.
Keep in mind, all these fireplaces in any of these 18th century buildings, the houses are more like windbreaks with a campfire. Yeah, things have changed a little bit. Yes?
So, how old is the house?
The evidence in this house points to maybe the 1730s. It's a very grand house for the time. It would have been built towards the end of Jan Van Hoosen's life. He died in 1745.
Now, 1730. Columbia County. But there's still Native Americans running around.
There were some. His grandfather actually purchased lands from the Native Americans. And I
Were they
believe
dangerous?
there doesn't seem, and I wish Ruth was here for this, but I do not recall, say, during any of the problems of the 18th century, that Columbia County was deeply impacted. I mean, earlier on at the end of the 17th century, you have Schenectady being burned in 1690 by French and Huron raiding parties. You have in the 1760s the French and Indian Wars again, where you have raids down in Ulster County along the Esopus. Even Queen Anne's War, which I think was early 1700s. You don't really have Columbia County at that time was a prosperous time, which is another reason why a point made that long after the Dutch had lost the colony, they lost the colony in 1664 to the British, probably very briefly for a few months in 1673, but in upstate New York, Dutch culture continued into the 19th century. But all of these great rural houses that you see being built are all being built primarily in the 1730s, 20s, 40s. So you're looking at a building tradition and kind of a relic culture 50 years after, their sovereign country had lost control of the territory. Things are so entrenched that you talk about well into the 19th century, coming back to the issue of slaves. Many of the slaves are still speaking Dutch. I went to school in Chatham, one of the African-American families there. Their name was Van Alstyne. There are still Van Alstynes in Chatham. So you still see some of that impact.
I just wanted to say that the Van Hoesens and the Van Rensselaers claimed that land, but the Van Hoesens had a deed from the Indians, so they went to court and they were able to get that land back. So I'm a Van Hoesen.
A lot of the 18th century, there was a lot of litigation between the two families, which is really interesting because this house sits east of the creek, which was an area of greatest contention. And without knowing all the mechanisms, it really wasn't until 1784 when one of the great-grandsons, the Van Hoesens, sells what became the site of the city of Hudson to the New England proprietors, is everybody gives up and the litigation ends because it's just become too big a thing to deal with. Yes.
Is this house mentioned in, I think it's called Visible Heritage, Ruth Kawanka and Blackburn's book? Maybe I have the title wrong. I thought it was called Visible Heritage.
I think that was the
I'm
title.
not sure if it is. Surprisingly, this house gets no mention in any books on Dutch houses until, I think, John Stevens' book, which was published 10 years ago. What drew me to this, although I'm always fascinated with this house, kind of, you forget about it. So it was back in 2005, I just happened to pick up the Clavert paper, Our Town, because I had a picture of the house on the cover, or in there, or actually the cover had a feature story on a woman I know in Clavert, and at the back was this, the title of the article was Hidden in Plain Sight. And it's true, and all the early people that documented these houses, like some of you are probably familiar with the Helen Wilkinson Reynolds book from the 1920s, where she traveled around and she picked up on the Van Allen house in Kinderhook, the Van Dusen house down on Spook Rock Road, but in between, it was just there. It's always just been there, but that was actually the gestation of our group. The article was an interview with Chuck Brizard. Some of you may have known him, who was fairly prominent in committees for the town of Clavert. So I contacted him thinking, hey, they need a technical guy. But the point was really just getting an operation off the ground. Chuck gets a lot of credit for getting this thing going. Actually, I have to say, he and I often disagreed on policy, but you can be civil and disagree in this country still. We always pushed it forward. Really. Yes.
I'm just curious if there are a lot of other Van Hoesens in this building, in this room here today.
Well, we have a couple here this evening.
Yes,
and they should stand
two
up.
ladies that wrote that.
These two. Oh, these two ladies who left said that they were.
And, we just received a donation tonight of the Van Hoesen Family Bible.
Oh, nice.
So now we're going to sort out a curatorship for it, which may be here at the library until we're better prepared. So we'll need to discuss that, Brenda, but I think that may be the safest repository for something this important.
And you can pray for money.
No, we just do it. It's all good.
A lot of Dutch descendants here, they're just not all named Van Hoesen.
Well, I have been in touch with the Van Hoesen family across the country. There's Van Hoes and there's Van Hoesers, and some have variations on the name where the Van has been dropped, but extensive family. But they all trace their lineage back to Jan Frans Van Hoesen. And an interesting thing about Jan Frans, they were a mariner family from an island up the north coast of Holland, the Netherlands, Hoesen, which at various times has also been German. So apparently what prompted him to emigrate to this country was in the late 1630s, there was this massive storm in the North Sea that pretty much washed away half the island or something and ruined the livelihoods, is my understanding of the history there. So he set out for New Amsterdam to find fame and fortune or whatever. Oh, we got a gentleman right
Well, I
there.
thought kind of an interesting thing is that he was a Lutheran
Yes.
and not necessarily Dutch.
Well, right. And the Van Hoesen family actually attended services in Lunenburg, which is now Athens across the river. They were communicants of that church. They were not communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church at Clavert. However, Jan married Tanneke Whitbeck from Clavert. Actually, I have to say that one of her great-great-grandsons or nephews is working with us also on the legal end. no Giffey would back here in Hudson. So, like I said, one of the most gratifying things is how people have stepped forward at the right time, just fill a void, enabling us to continue without, needing tons of money. So, we're approaching a point where we are going to need more money, but we've been making progress, and that's gratifying. Anyone else? Okay, Brenda, you can.
Thank you so